In the previous reading, we learned about inferential racism and the ways in which non-Hispanic whites responded to civil rights laws and Supreme Court decisions with coordinated collective politics characterized by resistance, refusal, and renegotiation to prevent minorities from being able to benefit from the opening of channels of mobility. According to Lipsitz, for more than 50 years, non-Hispanic whites resisted measures to combat discrimination. They undermined attempts to create equal opportunities for minority populations. And in the face of that resistance, refusal, and renegotiation, though, change still happened. I've asked you to read only the executive summary, the introduction, and the summary of this report published by the Civil Rights Project. But I am going to show you some data to help with the highlights of the report. As with other pieces, you are only responsible for the material which I've assigned, and this lecture is designed to walk you through some of the social facts that are related to the main ideas. Now, despite white resistance, refusal, and renegotiation of anti-discrimination efforts of the past 50 to 60 years, the desegregation that did take place, the opening of channels of mobility that did take place, had real consequences for those schools and school districts that were part of the discrimination lawsuits. Southern school districts, ironically, even those with overt resistance to integration, are among the most integrated school districts across the country. And what the research has shown us is that integration has been quite transformative for the individual Black students who are able to attend integrated schools. They're more likely to experience higher achievement than their Black student counterparts who did not attend integrated schools. They're more likely to have college success than their Black peers who did not go to integrated schools. And when they go to college, or when they went to college, they were more likely to go to more selective schools than their Black peers who didn't go to integrated schools. Research has also found that they had significantly higher incomes, better jobs, lower incarceration rates, and better health indicators than their Black peers who did not go to integrated schools. So integration, even as modest as it was, in contrast to what, especially in contrast to what could have been, had real success for, or translated into real success for individuals, if not for the entire minority groups as a whole, who were still being affected by the inferential racism. The researchers of this report noted that the 1974 Supreme Court case, Milliken versus Bradley, really stifled the transformational potential of the court-mandated integration of schools, because that decision allowed children of white suburbs to avoid integration with urban centers where children of color were concentrated. Recall that during the 1930s, we got standardized practices of creating white-only communities. And when the Milliken case was decided, those communities could create their own school districts and perpetuate a dual education system, one for whites and one for children of color, except it was at the district level, not at the school level. And when you couple this fact with the end of federal aid for busing in the early 1980s and the end of most desegregation plans in the 1990s, the institutional inferential racism was able to snap back into place. This time, though, affluent people of color were able to move outside of the former race-based red lines, and they moved into more affluent communities in search of better educational opportunities for their children. And what emerged from this change of events, the Milliken decision, the end of financial support for busing, the end of desegregation. Oh, and we could add, right, the end of redlining. Those events basically resulted in a resegregation of communities, but the resegregation or the segregation was a double segregation, according to these researchers. Now that the affluent people of color could move out of those designated Black neighborhoods, which they did, right, moving into previously white-only neighborhoods in an attempt to get their children access to better education. And because white families typically didn't move into these communities of color the way that families of color moved into white neighborhoods, again, because schools for children of color historically have been worse by design, right? So this leaves the communities of color racially and now economically isolated. This is a consequence, again, of affluent people of color no longer being bound to live in certain neighborhoods because of race-based zoning. But the discontinuation of policies isn't the only reason why we get the double segregation. You have to look at demographic shifts in our population, and you can see that those demographic shifts are also contributing to the double segregation. Look at these population trends. First, we see the Hispanic population growth in raw numbers. Notice the darker blue at the bottom is the population growth in millions for foreign-born foreign-born Hispanics. And in the 1950s, the Hispanic foreign-born population was really very small, right? And then over time, you start to see that it grows pretty rapidly. And then in the 1990s, you notice that there's a big shift in the slope, and that's in part related to policy changes that increase the number of foreign-born individuals that are allowed to come into our country. Now, the thing with the foreign-born individuals is that when they immigrate to the United States, they tend to immigrate as adults, and adults in their prime fertility years. And so when you see the corresponding increase in the population growth here in that grayish blue color, that's the people being born in the United States, and you see that that's actually pretty large right there. And that's coupled with, that's a combination of people who lived in the United States, having and born in the United States having children, but also the foreign-born population having children. Right, so you've got this huge growth in the Hispanic population, where in 1990 we're barely at over 20 million people, and then just 20 years later we've more than doubled our population. We're now more than 50. Now you take that population growth, and I want you to look at the fertility rates in the United States for the major racial categories. And what we see, and I call your attention to the non-Hispanic white line here, right, from this is 1980 through 2010, so basically 30 years. Consistently, what you're seeing is that the white population has a fertility rate that's well below 2. And basically what that means is that they are not replacing the people who are dying off. So you're seeing a contraction in their population numbers. Now compare that to the Black fertility rate, which was consistently over 2 for about 20 years, and then starts to dip below 2, or for more than 20 years, and then dips below 2 in 2010. And then if you look at Hispanics, their numbers are almost at 3. And so, our fertility rates are so much higher. We're younger. Hispanic immigrants tend to have higher fertility rates than native-born immigrants. And so this contributes to our population growth, but it will also play a role in the shift in the demographics of our public schools. So let's turn to some of those data. So this, you can see, I said again, like that negative, or that fertility rate of less than 2 has real consequences in terms of the number of people in the country. And here we can see this in the enrollment rates by race for whites. In 1968, almost 35 million students in public schools were white, but in 2016, the number is less than 24 million. Now look at the Black student population. In 1968, there's 6.3 million Black students in public schools, and in 2016, the numbers increased modestly to 7.5 million. Now look at the Latinos. We're just 2 million students in 1968, but by 2016, we ballooned to 13 million. That's more than a 600% increase in our numbers in public schools. That last table was one reporting the raw numbers. These are the percentages over time. In 1970, white students were almost 80% of the public school population. In 2016, they're now a minority, less than 50%, or a numerical minority anyway. African Americans' proportions remain relatively stable over the time period at around 15%. And then Latinos, though, we go from just 5% of the student population in 1970 to 26.3% of the student population in 2016. Now, the report shows the declines across the regions of the country. From 2006 to 2016, the decline of the proportion of students is more dramatic in some regions over others, as is the increase in the Hispanic student population. Look at the border region, for example. Note that Texas is part of the South, it's not part of the border. The Latino population in the border region almost doubles in the 10-year period of time. In the South, which Texas is a part of, the Latino proportion grew by 31%, still pretty dramatic. But in the West, it only grew by 13.5%. The racial composition of schools is really changing at different rates, but the common patterns are that white enrollment has declined and Latino enrollment has increased. Central cities have more diverse enrollment. Non-metro areas, the suburbs and the rural communities have the greatest percentage of white students, but even here, the proportion of minority students has increased. Again, think back to the elimination of race-based zoning for housing and the demographic shifts in populations. The demographic shifts coupled with the changes in policies have led to a shift in the percentage of intensely segregated schools for both exclusively white schools, but almost exclusively Black schools. So I'm going to be using this term of intensely segregated schools to refer to schools that have more than 90% of white students or more than 90% of non-white students. Notice that in 1988, only 5.7% of schools were intensely segregated non-white schools. Schools whose student population were between 90 to 100% non-white students. That proportion increased to 18.2%. That is more than a 300% increase in the proportion of schools that are almost all non-white. Now, look at the intensely white schools. Nearly 40% of them nearly 40% of schools in 1988 were intensely segregated white schools, compared to only 16% today. So yes, there are fewer intensely segregated white schools today, but there's also a far greater percentage of intensely segregated non-white schools. Nearly 1 out of every 5 schools is intensely segregated non-white. Now, a troubling observation is that those intensely segregated non-white schools are also very likely to be economically segregated as well. Now, in 2001, 88% of those schools had more than 50% of their students coming from low-income households. So a lot of these schools, right, had over 50% of the students being poor. But when you look at 2011, half of these schools, right, are actually having have student enrollments where more than 90% of their students are coming from low income households. So they're almost exclusively non-white and almost exclusively poor. Again, so that means that we're going to be dealing with the issues that are associated with poverty. I want you to think about the things that Hochschild and Berliner talked about in terms of these schools that have high concentrations of poor people and people of color. Now, contrast that with the poverty rates of intensely white schools. In 2001, about 15% of the intensely segregated white schools had low-income students, or about 15% of the intensely white schools, about 15% of the students of the intensely white schools were low-income students, right? So the vast majority of students are going to not be low income. And then in 2011, even fewer of the students are low income. Only 2% of the student population at these intensely segregated white schools were students from low income households. So these schools are going to be whiter and more affluent. Now, again, think about Hochschild's work on urban schools and her assertion that schools were grappling with fundamentally different issues and had fundamentally different student populations compared to other schools across the country. This is what the researchers are referring to, or not this, but the intense segregation around racial isolation, but also the economic isolation that we see where white schools, those intensely segregated white schools, have almost no poor students, and a huge portion of the intensely segregated minority schools are also almost exclusively poor schools. That's the double segregation that the authors are talking about. Now, look at the demographics of the typical student. So this table, I think, always kind of troubles people. Like, how do I wrap my head around this? It's basically this idea that if you take and you group all of the white students together, and then you're just going to pluck a white student out of that pool of white students, and you ask that student, what does your student population look like at your school, right? And it's just like the typical student that you pull out of the crowd. You'll see that the typical white student will go to a school that is majority white, where nearly 70% of the students at that school are white. But the typical Black student and the typical Hispanic student, if you pluck them out, right, you group all of them together and you go, okay, I'm just going to grab a Black student from this pool of Black students. I'm going to grab a Latino student from this pool of Latino students. What proportion of their school, and ask them, what proportion of your school is made up of white students, non-Hispanic white students? And what you see is that those Black and Latino students typically go to schools where about 25% of the student population is white. So these aren't, right, Black and only schools anymore, or white only schools anymore for the typical student. And so for the students attending those schools, you're like, oh, look, there's racial diversity. But again, we're missing how pronounced the racial disparities are at the schools by noticing that you've got, right, more diversity at that school, at those schools. And the typical Black and Latino student is going to a school where nearly 75% of the students are not white. Now, these are the percentages of Black students who are attending intensely segregated non-white schools by region. Now, since 1968, notice that the Northeast has nearly half of the Black students going to intensely segregated non-white schools. And that proportion is higher than it was in 1968. Right. No other region has the same pattern, though, but the proportion of students in intensely non-white schools has increased in every region since 1988. The other thing that this table shows us is that even those half-assed integration plans had an impact on intense segregation. Policies did matter. And when we eliminated the policies, we got retrenchment. This is why Angela Davis says that in order to combat the effects and consequences of racism, we must be anti-racist. It requires an active resistance against racism and its inferential policies. Notice how different the patterns are for Latinos. And again, like, part of this relates to where they have been concentrated historically and the fact that their numbers are growing. Look at the West, where in 1968, only 11% or almost 12% of Latino students went to intensely segregated non-white schools, compared to 27% in 1988. Again, population growth. But then if you go to 2016, now it's 46.2% of the Latino students are going to schools that are more than 90% non-white. You see in the Midwest, there hasn't really been a dramatic change from 1988, though if you look at 1968, it's huge. In the border area, you see that there's actually not data collected or available. But even here from 2001 to 2016, there's an increase in the percentage of Latino students going to intensely segregated non-white student schools. And in the South, there is some change, but again, it's not as dramatic as the other ones. Now, notice in the last 10 years, the typical white student is attending schools that are still majority white, but that the concentration has been declining. I mentioned this again before, but I just did want you to be cognizant of the fact. And that's why you can have parents that say, my gosh, our schools look so much different than they did when I was a child. It's because, again, there have been some major demographic shifts. And there have been policy shifts where affluent people of color have been able to move into neighborhoods that they were previously excluded from because their race was more important than their, economic resources, their educational credentials, the kind of occupations they had. Now, the disparities in the racial and economic isolation, the educational disparities are huge. Hochschild talked about it. Berliner talked about it. So I'm not going to talk about it here. But I did want to remind you that the response to the unequal education that these children are experiencing, especially right in those racially intensely segregated non-white schools, the response has been more testing and more accountability requirements. That is what Berliner was referring to when he talked about the failure of educational reform, right? Because these things are not addressing the increased racial segregation that's being compounded by the economic segregation. They're not addressing the things that lead to that racial and economic segregation, which are parts of our educational reality that we're just not acknowledging, but that continue to produce very unequal life chances for our children, right? We have to look at Berliner's work to appreciate what these children in racially isolated non-white communities are facing. And so I want you to pay attention to that because, right, the structure of our education system, the organization of our education system, our history, right, our historical reality have created these patterns that produce unequal life chances for children of color. And again, we tend to say that we're okay with inequality that exists in our society because we think of the education system as a system that creates like equal opportunity for children. And the data just show that that is not the case. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We have like 2 more pieces that we're going to be reading that are related to race and education.